Welcome to Perspectives in Mobile, the news podcast from the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Join us discussing the world of telecommunications, technology, and mobile innovations. From Florence, Ricardo Amati.
Welcome to a new episode of Math Podcast Series Perspectives, in which experts and industry leaders talk about what they think, see, and expect in the world of technology, telecommunications, and innovative mobile services. Cybersecurity, mobile fraud, and privacy concerns are travel companions of digitalization. The cybercrime industry is expanding exponentially. Detect and identify cyber threats, respond and recover faster from ransomware is paramount. We talk about that with David Dunn, Head of EMEA Cybersecurity at FTI Consulting. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me, Ricardo.
Thank you for joining us. David Dunn has more than 20 years of experience advising multinational corporations on risk and transactions in markets around the world, and is an expert in data privacy and cybersecurity resilience, prevention, response, remediation, and recovery. David, some figures from the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the US. Americans lost in 2023 $10 billion to scammers. It's a 14% increase compared to the previous year. That's just in the US. At what pace globally is the cost of cyber attacks rising for the economy?
So most observers think about a 15% annual growth in cybercrime costs over the next 5 years. Currently, it's anticipated that the cost of cybercrime will hit 10.5 trillion USD by 2025. That's up 3 trillion from USD from 2015. So it is a significant issue. It continues to grow, and the costs are certainly significant.
What are the new threats? There are many, but some of them.
Yeah, I think, listen, the increasing sophistication in things like ransomware, deepfakes are certainly concerning. We see increasing nation-state activities, and I think, something I know we'll talk about later in the conversation, right? The continued threat to the supply chain and sophisticated threats at that, I think are just some of the new threats that we'll see. And of course, there is a lot of talk right now about AI. We are certainly seeing AI make threat actors more efficient. We haven't yet seen significant AI attacks, but they're certainly it's certainly on everybody's radar for the future.
Yeah, it has transformative impact on attacks. Does it have that on defense as well?
Yeah, I think, it certainly does. There are a lot of technology companies that are putting a lot of time and effort and money into developing machine learning and AI capabilities in their cybersecurity tooling. So I think there has been a significant amount of progress. I don't know that we can yet call that progress true artificial intelligence, but certainly from a machine learning perspective, we've seen a lot of advancement, right? The ability to detect, specific types of threats, anticipate threats, identify malicious activity early on. All those things, right, are certainly being built into security technology. And as time goes on, it's just going to get better. I think there are other, beyond just identifying threats. I think there are other areas in which AI will ultimately be helpful in areas like regulation and policy frameworks and so on and so forth. But we're really just in early days of this at this point.
One thing about AI, it produces fantastic deep fakes. 2024 is the year of election. How strong is the risk?
Yeah, I mean, the risk is significant, and I think, if we're thinking about, the biggest threats and, some of the scariest stuff when it comes to cybersecurity, there's no question that deepfakes are significant. We know historically, and we've been talking about this at least since 2016, we know historically that that misinformation in elections, threats, specific cyber threats to elections, have been an issue. Deepfakes and the continued sort of advancement and sophistication of those deepfakes are certainly something that worries me. The ability to detect those in real time is not where it needs to be. On top of that, deepfakes are getting posted right to social media platforms, and once that's online and ultimately is viewed by individuals, even if it's identified as a deepfake and later taken down, the spread of misinformation becomes a massive threat to elections, and so it's something we should be very concerned about. There's a significant amount of erosion of trust in government or candidates as a result. And so I think it represents a massive threat for election security without any question.
Supply chain, you mentioned supply chain. How to counter attacks to the supply chain?
So it's difficult depending on the supply chain incident, but I think the place that organizations need to start is with their third-party vendor risk management programs. When we at FTI assess the controls in place at organizations, third-party vendor risk management is often an area that needs improvement. And so if we want to try and significantly counter supply chain attacks, you need to think about your vendors and everybody in your supply chain in a similar fashion to how you think about your own cybersecurity controls. Right? You need to categorize, classify all of your vendors based on risk. You need to push requirements to them from a security perspective, which really ensure that they are taking proper steps in an organized way to manage security at their own organization. Oftentimes, these third parties that you have in your supply chain are going to have access to your systems and your data, right? So it's really critical to expect a very, very high level of cybersecurity maturity around all of your third parties, right? And you have to push those requirements to them. If they're not willing to do that, then I think organizations really need to take hard steps to walk away from vendors that aren't willing to put the controls in place that are needed to protect their environments, but also to protect your data as a third party in that scenario.
We put everything in the cloud for security reason and for privacy reason, but the cloud is not secure anymore. How to counter attack the clouds?
Yeah, I mean, cloud security has obviously been a big topic. I think, there had been a trend where organizations were moving data into the cloud, and there was, in a number of instances, a general misunderstanding of what that meant. So people were expecting some form of enhanced security because they were moving things from their own on-premise environments to the cloud. But the reality is that you're responsible for the controls in those cloud environments, right? And so it requires a significant amount of attention. You're moving stuff from your computers to somebody else's computers at the end of the day. So, thinking about managing data access, right, and identity and access management in those cloud environments, right, encrypting data within those cloud environments, right, keeping cloud environments backed up separately, right, tracking the devices that are connecting to your cloud environments, using source control, right, so using source control to secure versions, right, of those environments. All of those things are important to securing your cloud environment, and it takes constant vigilance and attention.
Internet of Things, one of the most promising new services, and again under attack more and more by cyber criminals. What's the key to defending this new service?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so ultimately the key is, and this is a bigger topic, right, and less out of our own control, but ultimately the key is making sure that these technology manufacturers that make IoT devices adopt a security by design thought process, right, and are properly building security into these devices. Certainly the U.S. government has pushed that, right, and as an expectation for large technology manufacturers. But at the end of the day, right, we live in a world where you have to secure these devices on your own. Some have better security functionality built into them than others. But if we're to give a checklist, we really want to think about making sure firmware and software on those devices is always updated, right? So make sure that you've got automatic updates on those devices turned on, and that you're not using out-of-date versions, whether that be on the firmware or the software side. Right? Make sure you change default usernames and passwords, right, so that they have unique and strong credentials. For an organization, a larger organization, right, network segmentation is important, right? Separating IoT devices into isolated networks or VLANs, right, to limit the potential impact of compromise is really important, right? Deploying network monitoring and intrusion detection systems on IoT devices is important. Something simple, right, that we've been talking about for a long time, utilizing multi-factor authentication, making sure that is in place, right, and that you have that turned on when you're using IoT devices is really important. And then, if you're an organization, right, you've got to assess the security of those devices in an organized way. You've got to penetration test those devices to identify vulnerabilities, and then make sure that you're remediating. And then at the end of the day, right, it's like many other things in security. It's about education, right? End user education, security and awareness training is really important, so they're being used correctly. If we think about IoT attacks in the home, a lot of those are a result of not turning on the right controls, right? Not having multi-factor authentication or unique, and robust credentials in place. So all those are things you can do to secure against IoT attacks. Of course, there are a number of other things, but I think, that checklist is a good start.
At the end of the day, one must be prepared, must study and educate himself. The human factor is still very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
David, is it more efficient to focus on cybersecurity or on cyber resilience? And what's the difference?
Sure.
Operatively?
So let me start by saying, this, right? Those are two very different things, right? And you can't and shouldn't try to achieve one without the other, right?
Right.
Cybersecurity is essentially the protection of an organization from, specific attacks or attack campaigns, and that's done via the deployment of specific controls to protect the organization, right? And the focus there is typically on preventing and detecting and responding to security incidents in real time. Cyber resilience is much broader, right? It refers to the concept that even with an appropriate set of controls in place to protect against known threats, some may evade some of those controls, right? Some of those threats may get past some of those controls. So really, cyber resilience refers to the ability of an organization to absorb, right? Meaning identify, contain, eradicate cyber attacks without suffering massive or unacceptable losses of service. And so again, they're two different things, and you can't do one without the other. There is a lot of talk, and I do think the future focus is going to be more and more on cyber resilience, right? The understanding that these attacks are going to happen, but mitigating the potential damage that those have, can be, is paramount. So, I think I don't know that I would opine on sort of the efficiency there. I think you need to do both. And I think, the awareness of proper cyber resilience continues to grow, and I think will be adopted more and more in the future.
Probably the next generation defense is more on resilience.
Sure.
Right. And about warfare and state-sponsored attacks, we were talking about cybersecurity and election, deepfakes. I know you're not a lawyer, but is a system of treaties similar to one that has been very much destroyed, but it used to be on nuclear proliferation possible? I mean, do you see something like that as a possibility? Or at least something that should be put in place?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a politician or diplomat. There's certainly the possibility, but I think one big problem with getting a global treaty is that you have two very distinct camps. Right? You've got those countries that are interested in freedom, but then there are those that are interested in controlling information, right, and the lack of freedom. And getting those two sides on the same page is going to be difficult. Now, there is a lot of conversation about this, and is movement at the UN. There is the goal to adopt a cybercrime treaty through the UN later this year. It is in final negotiations, but there are a number of variables. Some of those variables have gotten pushback from large tech companies, for example. And so I can't predict whether that gets done. There have been, certainly, predecessors like the Budapest Agreement and so on and so forth. But certainly the direction of travel is good. But I don't know that will necessarily move the needle and stop some of the issues that we're seeing from specific nation states like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and so on and so forth.
And about regulation, what should the key elements of cybersecurity regulation be? Does the Defiance Act go in the right direction?
So, I mean, starting with the latter part of that, right? The Defiance Act is unquestionably a critical piece of regulation, but its links to cyber are a little bit limited. But foundationally, right, the things that cybersecurity regulations needs to consider, right, is relatively complex, but trying to simplify it a bit here for the conversation, right? I think proportionality is really important, right? So requirements should be proportionate to the scale and the nature and the complexity of the business being regulated. It's not reasonable nor fair in real terms for a small retail company, for example, to be held to the same bar as a Fortune 100 financial institution. I think, after proportionality, right, protection is also important, right? Regulation should link to the proportionality that I mentioned, insofar as regulatory requirements should scale with the potential harm that a successful attack, can have on the public or stakeholders or the supply chain or other partners within a specific company's operating environment, right? I think they also need to be sustainable. So sustainability is important for regulations. They need to ensure that measures are taken that are actually sustainable for each enterprise that has to adhere to those, right? Cyber resilience, as we were talking about earlier, is a cost of doing business, but it shouldn't be a price that puts an organization out of business, right? And I think the next two components, right, for regulation to consider our perimeter, right, ensuring that the regulatory requirements also capture the impact that third parties have on organizations, as we were talking about earlier. And then lastly, fragmentation. Regulations really shouldn't vary materially across jurisdictions wherever that can be helped. And we are seeing, right, if we think about Europe, we are seeing regulatory fragmentation, and that makes it really difficult for organizations to manage. And so, the more we can have unified, less fragmented approaches by regulators, I think the better. So, if I'm going to look at sort of the keys for regulations, right, those are the ones I would mention, right? Proportionality, protection, sustainability, perimeter, and fragmentation.
That's very clear, David. Is that true that there is a shortage of professionals with the skills needed to protect organizations from cyber attacks?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think the numbers that have continued to be thrown around are something like a 3.5 million, right, unfilled roles because the skills don't exist. And, there's no question that that's true. When we look everywhere from sort of small and mid-sized enterprises onto larger organizations, there's no question that deep cybersecurity expertise can be missing, right, or is missing. Smaller organizations, right, have a harder time finding specific cyber talent that can help defend their organizations. Sometimes that's not necessarily a result of a shortage, but also not understanding where to go, right, or that they need specific cyber skills. But there often are people that have skill sets that are more on the IT side of things that are forced into or put into the security side. But the simple response is absolutely. There is no question there is a shortage of experienced cybersecurity folks. Now, cybersecurity is very broad and very deep, and there are obviously a number of different disciplines within cybersecurity. So depending on the discipline you're talking about within cybersecurity, there can be bigger shortages, but we definitely need more people. I think universities and other organizations are starting to do a very good job training, right, and turning out good entry-level talent. But we have to see that talent move through the ranks and gain, right, practical experience to help close the gap.
What do you think is the perfect mix of skills? In general, of course, there are different areas, as you were saying, but should that be like an IT nerd with security officer experience? What kind of skills are essential?
Really, right, difficult question because it really depends on what we're trying to address within an organization. But let me answer it this way. Cybersecurity and IT are very different things, right? Cybersecurity is very nuanced, right? There are, as I mentioned, a number of sub-disciplines within cybersecurity, but that requires specific, extensive training to do well. Of course, to be a good cybersecurity person, you have to understand the basics, right? For example, the basics of IT, right? You have to understand, generally, you don't have to be a systems engineer, but you certainly need to understand the concepts. And so having a good core foundation from an IT side is important. But then it comes down to specific cybersecurity training and expertise, depending on the discipline that you're that you're going into. So, what's important for an offensive security person or somebody sitting in a SOC is different than somebody who's sitting on the audit side. So it's going to vary. But I think, being a utility player from a technology standpoint and an IT standpoint, but having specific cybersecurity expertise is really critical.
Right. Let's try to wrap up. If you were asked, as you are asked now, what are the main challenges for cybersecurity today? in a few lines.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of challenges, right? So I mentioned regulatory fragmentation. So for organizations, for example, that are multinationals, handling regulatory fragmentation is very difficult, right? You've got regulations coming out of the U.S. You've got regulations, right? Numerous regulations coming out of the EU, new regulations in the Middle East. And so that's a huge challenge. I think we already talked about staff, right? Getting the right people is important. I think there are challenges inside of organizations balancing the sort of conflicting agendas between CIOs or CTOs and CISOs, right? Making sure that the budget is properly there for cybersecurity is unquestionably a challenge. And then at the end of the day, right, threat actors have always really been a couple steps ahead of where we are in terms of defending our organizations from a technology standpoint, from a process and control standpoint, and that's going to continue, right? I mean, the threat landscape continues to get more challenging. It continues to evolve, and I think evolving your organization with that becomes a large challenge, right? It's a constant process, and if we think about things just as simple in theory as cyber risk management programs have typically been managed, right, and thought about the same way for quite some time. But that's like playing whack-a-mole, if you will, right? The thought process is typically, let's protect everything, let's fix every vulnerability. That's a huge challenge, right? So evolving to a world where you are thinking about cyber risk management, as an example, from a threat-led or an intelligence-led perspective, where you can focus on the things that are most at risk, I think becomes really important. But putting those programs in place and doing them properly is quite a challenge. So all of those things are challenges. There's a lot to keep us up at night from a cyber perspective.
Last question, David, is a question that we are asking all experts and CEOs when we talk about technology. If you close your eyes for some seconds and let's say you reopen in the future, let's say 10 years from now, what do you see? Not necessarily in terms of cybersecurity, but just in general.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're going to evolve in a number of different ways, right? I mean, we talked about AI a little bit. I mentioned that we haven't yet seen evidence of sophisticated AI attacks or AI-driven attacks, but I do think that that's a possibility in the future. I think that we are going to continue to see increased attacks on the supply chain that become more and more sophisticated, without any question. And I think, there will be a number of new types of attacks as we see things like the metaverse develop, right? There are going to be a number of new challenges there, and I'm sure that components of the metaverse will become a real reality, and that's going to change sort of the face of the future from a cybersecurity perspective. So all of those things, right, are things that we think about in the future. And on top of that, right, we will ultimately get to a passwordless world. We will ultimately also be in a world of quantum computing, which is going to create a whole new set of challenges, right? The question is not sort of if on the quantum computing side, it's a when, and that people have varying thoughts on that. But we will ultimately have significant challenges as a result of that as well. And I think, lastly, I would mention that I think the blurring of lines between nation-state cyber espionage campaigns and traditional cyber crime is going to continue to blur, and I think that's going to that'll pose a significant challenge.
Thank you, David. David Dunn, Head of EMEA Cybersecurity at FTI Consulting. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, Ricardo. It was a pleasure.
That's all for this episode of Perspective, the MEF podcast where experts and industry leaders talk about what they think, see, and expect in the world of technology, telecommunications, and innovative mobile services. Stay tuned. From Riccardo Amati, goodbye and good luck with your work.
Thanks for listening to Perspectives in Mobile. Join us next as we explore telecoms, technology, and mobile innovations. Stay tuned, stay connected, and let's unlock the mobile potential together.